Hey, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, when we talk about officers who participated in the war, we usually talk about those battle events where you have the sword wielding cavalry officer who is leading a charge with the horses galloping and all the noise of battle surrounding him. Or we think about the infantry officer who's on the front lines of his regiment, waving the sword, leading the men forward, or on horseback. We don't often think and talk about the staff officers who exposed themselves to quite a bit of danger. They were in the uncomfortable spot of relaying orders and information back and forth between their superior officer and the troops. And so they came in all shapes and all sizes. You had young men, old men who served in this capacity. And one of those young men is pictured here. And his story, really his military story, begins in 1859. His name is Warren Adams. He's a son of South Carolina and the son of a former governor of South Carolina, James Hopkins Adams. Young Warren graduated from the Citadel in 1859, and a couple of years later, when the Civil War is on the verge of happening, he is in the 1st Infantry Regiment of the short-lived Army of South Carolina. That army is spread out among the defenses around Charleston Harbor. All the guns are pointing at Fort Sumter. Now, Adams at the time was an aide-de-camp to one of the officers in command of part of the defenses around the harbor. And his job, Warren Adams's job, was to deliver messages back and forth between Mortar Battery 2 and Fort Moultrie. And in fact, on April 11th, 1861, which is 162 years ago today, Adams was ferrying mass messages back and forth, orders during the night, preparing for what everyone knew was going to happen very, very soon. That activity, that action happened a day later, April 12th, 1861, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, inaugurating Civil War. So here is young Warren Adams, who is playing a role as an aide-de-camp during that event. Like many men, many young men, he continued to fight on in the Confederate Army. There's two particular events that he was also involved in and wounded in each of these actions. The first one is one that I'll bet many of you are very familiar with. This was in July of 1863 at Fort Wagner. On that nighttime assault by the 54th Massachusetts Infantry and other Union troops, Warren Adams was there. He was one of the defenders of Fort Wagner, also known as Battery Wagner. And during that action, he was at the head of Fort Wagner's guns, in command of those guns. And as he was moving about, he was hit in the back and the head by fragments, shell fragments or bullet fragments, we don't exactly know, but he did suffer wounds during the Battle of Fort Wagner. So that's July 1863, July 18th, 1863, a little more than 2 years after Fort Sumter. So he recovers from these injuries and goes back to serve in the Charleston area. In fact, Adams is in the Charleston area all the way until February 1865, when Charleston falls. He leaves Charleston for the first time in practically 4 years of war and heads to North Carolina, trying to join the army of Joe Johnston, one of the few large bodies of Confederate troops left in the field. He makes it up to North Carolina, and then at the Battle of Bentonville, North Carolina, in late March 1864, he receives his second wound of the war. That's in the left side of his chest. He survives, continues on, and winds up being with Joe Johnston's army. He attaches himself to Joe Johnston's army, and he is surrendered along with the rest of the army by Johnston on April 26, 1865. So there you have it, the story of a young man, a graduate of the Citadel, who cast his lot with his home state of South Carolina. April 11th, 1861, he is an aide and plays a small but important role in sending orders back and forth so that the Confederate forces, that short-lived Army of South Carolina, can do what it's going to do the next day, April 12th, 1861, Fort Sumter. So there you have it. Today's Life on the Civil War Research Trail. We'll be back with a new episode tomorrow. Until then,